What's up? It's me, Nails, again, bitch, and I have a great recommendation for you today. One of the most famous fantasy novels of all time, one of my favorite books of all time, A Clash of Kings by George Martin, the 1998 fantastical masterpiece, the second book in the Song of Ice and Fire series. It's about 770 pages, and it will take you a minute to read, that's for sure. Most lines of the novel in general are condensed with backstory, which elicits long implications. And there's just so many details to the world building, but not too many that really put you to sleep, as there's somehow a forward momentum in the plot. The details are narrated in a not such a poetic way, but poetic enough. Poetic enough to have the prosaic element of classiness and finer speech, but not to the point of sort of rhythmic melody like Tad Williams might put you to sleep. And so the plot compels itself forward throughout. So there are so many huge meta symbols in this story that represent eternally, timelessly relevant to any given point in human civilization. That's one of the reasons it is spiritually fantastorical and so perhaps subconsciously moving to the average person. It's in our blood to be. There's something eerily familiar with the civil apocalyptic nature of Westeros in this second novel, as things really, the breakdown and the competition for the game of for the Iron Throne is really kicked into high gear. And so that to me is the greatest takeaway of the book. There's so much to offer in this novel that elicits so many ideas, and it's all together so well written and brutally illustrated that it's the impact overall that makes it a favorite. Because as I've said many times in my review videos of various books of various genres, I have a hard time getting immersed. Well, this story pulls no punches, is not politically correct. Instead, it focuses on the real ugly side of humanity, the real heart of what some might call the natural man, that is based in history, albeit some areas are exaggerated for dramatic effects, such as the story's often frequent over focus on sadistic and grotesque things, sometimes involving sexual abuse and things of that nature, which are depressing and gross. But I didn't think it was terribly offensive, because the overall tone, despite all of the darkness it analyzes, while basically the worst attributes and ironies of humanity, especially seen through the main leaders of across the Seven Kingdoms, as they each craftily, play the game and of power and deception and wartime maneuvers to outdo each other, blinded by sometimes, especially the Lannisters, by the sort of collective hive mind approach, where it's like a super ego of their house, where just complete narcissism and pride and a sort of holier than thou quality to justify human atrocities. And you realize more and more so than the first book, that a lot of these traditions they don't have a sort of personal attachment to. So some of it on an individual basis seems forgivable to the characters, and I think they're more understandable because their nature is ingrained in the extremely deep, complex details of the world building, and offers a sort of understanding that only really works in very fantasy fiction. So, in other words, if they were characters from our world, most of them would have irredeemable qualities, and it allows you to see the potential states of mind of various infamous past historical figures or people engaged in historical events, especially in medieval Europe and such, who may have believed in what they were doing but had no real long-term altruistic moral view to sort of zoom out and see their present actions, if they happen to violate moral laws in the greater context of what's right and wrong, because they belong to the similar like collective narcissism. Like, it's sort of like you could call it ultra nationalism and stuff, and that's eternally interesting and has so many applications that will provoke the mind. There's definitely future reading potential of this series, and also some of just the coolest dialogue and some of the coolest scenes. The action scenes are also extremely immersive, extremely brutal, fast paced. You would think that George Martin lived through medieval combat, because he writes it so well and so immersively. So it's not pleasing, it's terrifying, and if you're like on occasion have hardcore tastes like me, it really gets you immersed in a way that it really has an effect on you as a challenge to read, and it sort of almost has the tone of horror in those areas at times as well. It's perhaps unintentionally inspiring and well, just because of the sheer grit and toughness of the characters. Morality aside, there isn't a whole lot of intellectual or sensitive aspects to these characters. Most characters are constrained in life by duty and have even the most royal, most privileged, powerful people, which are most of the main characters in the book, with a few exceptions. They're when you really spend time with them and get into their nuanced, thought processes, which are also really well written and extremely believable, I might add, for being such a fantastic world that it's set in. All things considered, you realize that they actually are bound by their house's belief systems in a way that is pretty bleak. And so the book is indirectly inspiring and not directly inspiring, with just a few exceptions. Like, was it Illyrio helping Sansa, and the weird, like, understanding she has with the Hound character. Small moments of heroism here and there where you're like, finally something. And so the book still has heart, but it's just so oppressed constantly by the tyranny of evil men and their blind pushes for narcissism to make a mark on history throughout their lives for their house's namesake, which has totally eroded any sense of altruism or morality, which is uncomfortably familiar in the greater context of history till now. So it is shocking for that reason. What was I going to say? I just went on 2-3 tangents and got lost, because it's easy to get lost in this book because it just has so much to offer. And but in general, I really do think it's about, if it has any given theme, and this is super summarizing here, it's tragedy and this feeling of oncoming inescapable fate or doom or death, which sometimes sneaks up and kills certain characters. It doesn't matter how important they were or are, nobody's really safe. That's another level of immersiveness and realism. Like I said, this book is written so honestly and true to itself, based on the passions and the interests of the author. There, as a standalone piece of fiction that's true to its genre, it really doesn't have any flaws to me, without being extremely nitpicky, so I'll just save them outside this video. Man, I have nothing but praise. This is one of my favorite fantasy book series of all times. But it's not for the faint of heart. It can be depressing at times. It's very intense. But that is kind of the point. I don't know how much of that was intended by the author. And so when I say it's empowering to read, it's because it challenges you so much as you progress through the story in a somewhat meta way, confronted by just the despair that the characters are going through as their world is collapsing, as the Stark Kingdom is constantly threatened in the ongoing campaign, the various royal Stark children, and so on. And boy, is there a very impactful ending arc to that literally had me in tears. I'm not kidding. I shed tears in books very seldomly, and only when I'm invested in caring about characters' lives over a long process and seeing them go through struggles does it remind me of the endeavors of relationships in my own past and life and present progressing against opposition similarly. And there's something universally sympathetic about that that's really, really profound. And it is just so moving and so human, even though there's just overwhelming amount of darkness that the book doesn't censor but goes straight into. Like the crimes against humanity that often take place when law and order is breaking down, and the sham that so much of the conventions of government claiming moral superiority and justice and law and order really are. The fact the book endeavors and makes a point of exposing that and exposing the frightening side of human nature mixed with ambition, like characters that will haunt your memory forever, like Theon Greyjoy, just pure bad energy, more or less specific to a certain time in a younger man's life, who has access to certain privileges. The proclivity for them to turn into monsters is to be expected in that case, and it's good stuff. It's gritty, powerful stuff. It's like a gut punch, but in a good way. It wakes you up. It sticks with you. I've read the book twice. I will definitely be reading the series in the future. Although it's been years, the nature of my life is to this point has been so busy. I haven't really had time to finish this series, and it's probably my second or third favorite book series of all time at this point in my life. I'm almost finished with A Storm of Swords for the first time, and I like it as much as A Clash of Kings, although I like A Clash of Kings probably 3 times more than A Game of Thrones. Although I think A Game of Thrones is tragic and dark, A Clash of Kings has everything that A Game of Thrones offers, but is at least twice as good in every area, and if not, it's 5 times as good in other areas. And so it's weird how they're similar in length, because I just think the first book establishes things and builds up tension, but then the war breaks out and the characters are truly challenged, and in those challenges they really become who they're destined to become. And there's something really profound to say about that, which the book doesn't elaborate too heavily on, but what I mean is, when, let's say you yourself are going through the worst possible scenario that you fear, like the breakdown of civilization, it begs the question, is there some greater meaning to life when you lose all control and the bottom falls out from underneath it? It's like how the spiritual analogy you hear in certain religious groups, how pressure makes a diamond, that sort of thing. Or the great classic Tolkien poem, or was it Tolkien or someone that said, another poet that said more or less that strong winds create the tallest trees with the deepest roots. They have to work that much harder to dig in and not be uprooted by the elements, and they're strengthened by the constant oppression and are pulling more moisture from the ground. And so there's applications in, it mostly presents the facts because the plot is so heavy and there's so much build-up, suspension, opposition, climactic, climax, and then sometimes a period of recuperation and processing the opposition and the trauma from a given character, if it's a certain battle or a certain moment of betrayal or treachery or this or that, without giving anything away. But there's so much action and so much political intrigue on a less complex political spectrum, so it maintains the escapist fantasy, medieval fantasy edge, because we're dealing with monarchies. We're not dealing with the complexities of bullshit republics and such, and so it doesn't go too heavily into these things. which is good for this type of thing because it helps you focus on, in my opinion, what really matters more, the human drama in as related to all these things, and there's so much of that. And a lot of people complain about having too many characters and not being able to keep track of it all. But I don't think that's a fair criticism. I think that's a lazy criticism because that goes into the territory of complaining what a book is not and not what a book actually is. So, um, what was I saying? I keep losing my train of thought because I get too passionate. This is why I avoid talking about my favorite books on my channel. It's because I futurely want to do long analysis videos that are like hours long and talk about my personal opinions, criticism, praise, and interpretations of themes and symbols and motifs that would involve spoilers. And my book review videos, which are different from my future analysis videos, which I'm planning to do in detail someday, are really just to get hyped to offer an example of fair criticism, to document my own intellectual process and growth as a point of inspiration with more books that I read, the more books that I read, and also to just hype people up about reading and giving books a try because it saddens me that such great quality can often miss certain potential target audience members when, for example, people are wasting their time on TikTok and social media and they don't know what they're missing. There's so many great books out there and so many that might be offer similar areas of quality and goodness or the same or better that don't have as much mainstream fame and attention as books like the Song of Ice and Fire series have achieved. And so but for the record, I happen to believe that in this case it is the attention and the fame is earned for a reason. It's obviously a passion project that the author's poured his life into, or a huge portion of it. And there's just layers and layers of genius and meaning you can take from the story and learning your whole life. And there's many different ways to interpret things that happen. One of the best qualities of the book is that it's very blunt and comes off as a sort of cinematic experience, meaning it doesn't elaborate too heavily as like a work of philosophical like a philosophical novel would, or speculative fiction. Instead, it presents what happens, which is relatable enough to things we, as just adults are experienced with in real life, our involvement with politics or connection to troubling relationships where there's power dynamics involved, which can be found in any family, by the way. And so psychologists would like have meaning to pull from the story as well. It's the real shit. But basically, no. Let me change that. Basically, I guess I was gonna say something and I changed my mind about how I wanted to say that, but let me say that better. Sorry. I get nervous sometimes. I overthink things. It really just happens. What happens, and it's so dramatic that the implications and the meaning is brilliantly left up to the reader. Sorry that took me so long to say. I wish I had time to edit these videos. I'm so sorry about that. But basically, that is, I think, one of the keys, one of the greatest techniques I've learned as a hobbyist writer myself from Martin. That, like, that's how to, really get your point across. Trusting the intellect of the readers. Cormac McCarthy's really good at that too, by the way. To make their own meaning out of it to an extent, but declaring your meaning through story and focusing on story and not focusing too much on speculation and expostulation and exposition and all those sorts of things, and too many monologues. Like he knows somehow, despite the huge amounts of information that establish everything, it's all so well balanced and well conceptualized that it has this long term, slow building, truly epic build up of this coming sense of doom, which I'm afraid that I'll never find another book out there that will ever have anything close to that, so that level of like specific things that I like in fiction that gets me immersed and is as tragic as it is engaging, like pulpy, wanting to know what happens next. But it's more than pulpy. It's like incorporated into things that I can relate to, that pretty much anyone can relate to. So A Clash of Kings is, in its own way, a masterpiece. Something that has spoken to me, a book that's just spoken to me more than any other book has in my life to this point. That gets me immersed like in a certain way that no other book ever has and probably ever will. For sure, I don't think it has universal appeal. There's going to be people who just don't have that same language, but I guess how can I describe it? It's something that's just so authentic to the darkness within us, or the potential for that, if not directly. Which has been a theme that's fascinated me throughout my whole life. It's why I'm drawn to horror, and you might be tempted to think, based on the book reviews I've done to this point on my channel, if you've seen any of that, that I'm like just focused on really negative stuff. But the truth is, I have a very wide eclectic taste. This just so happens to be one of my absolute favorites. I make time to read like furry stuff, romantic, lighthearted, like manga, light fantasy, high fantasy, fantasy about bards, good cartoons. Like I like everything, but it just so happens that the last few years and who I've come to be at this point in my life, it's these books in particular that are the best example I could possibly think of, like, of the type of books that I feel define me as a reader. Of which I think George Martin, when this came out, set the bar for the level of quality that should exist or could exist. If one's telling a story that actually has something to say. And there's a rebellious streak against conforming to preconceived collective hive mind perceptions of what's proper and politically correct in the modern culture, collective war of opinions of what, like, when we should or shouldn't condemn certain thought processes and behaviors, especially in regards to sexuality. And that is a huge, like, it strikes a nerve with anyone who's going to read. It's going to offend you, it's going to shock you, but remember that it's fictional, and that's kind of the point. It's to get you to reconsider what you believe and what you value in these things, and because it's fictional, there's no consequences. So it is a much better place to, like, see potential negative consequences in the book, which the book responsibly shows, of a lot of these, like, disturbing topics which humanity has a present and past collective history of never being able to escape from. It's without that original evil, that's where civilization evolves to make things like corrupt, oppressive governments and that sort of thing. But this isn't a much more raw, universal analysis of that through story, which is the most effective way to illustrate a concept that the author wants to bring attention to, obviously. And I think that is something that perhaps is better left unsaid, and it's better just to experience the story. I wish I had I can't wait to one day make analysis videos of the actual plot and not just essentially sell the book to potential fans, by talking about the meaning of certain things. I will, no spoiler, but I will say one of the most iconic and memorable for me is the seduction of Stannis Baratheon, by Melisandre, or I'm not sure how to pronounce these names. I've never watched the show, so and I don't look at guides or anything. I would probably watch the show someday, but I always wanted to finish the books first. But man, I am loving them so much more than I ever thought. The first time I read Clash of Kings was, I want to say, 4 years ago, and then I finished it a few months ago for the second time, and I liked it much better the second time. Oh, the last thing I want to say, to be fair, in my criticism, not to let my own bias for the things I do like um, about the book take away from my responsibility as a critic who's trying to connect people to it if they might like it. I'll give my honest criticism in a few areas. These are tiny criticisms, and I don't have many, so bear with me. So anyway, one is that the frequency of the moments in which the author chooses to focus on the most negative aspects of humanity is intentionally exaggerated for dramatic effect, and that becomes obvious because a lot of those instances start to seem implausible, and the language by which he describes those things does get annoying and offensive to me at times. And I don't really want to go into detail about why, but anyone who's familiar with George Martin's works ought to know what I'm implying here. And it usually has to do with things like rape and sexual abuse, or the exploitation of women in general. Which is like, I know why it's there, but it's the style that occasionally bothered me and slightly took me out of the story. And not always stuff having to do with abusive sex in general, but or abuse related to sex, but just sadistic shit and violence that's like another level of the type of horror that I don't like. Which is ironically like understated in reviews of the show or the adaptions or the books themselves, like anywhere on the internet. And I think it's because my theory of that briefly is that modern Western society is emotionally and spiritually numb, and especially in American media and entertainment, that's the standard now. Like, things can go, there is no more spirit of reservation or censorship. If things can go into detail to drive up the shock factor, they will. And I admire the book in one sense for doing that to me, but when it comes to something I admire much more, a principle much higher, which is immersiveness, which is not a word, it's a word I made up, but immersion, it does diminish a little bit. So I think it's a very almost unnoticeable flaw that's barely worth mentioning. And like I said, it's not the nature of the instances of negative content; it's the frequency and the way the language the author uses to describe them that gets under my skin a little bit. My other complaint. What was my other complaint? In tandem with that, it's the lack of altruism and compassion in general in the entire world of Westeros. And while, like, human beings have a long history of helping out total strangers when bad things happen, when Law and Order breaks down, it's not always an opportunity for the beast in men to come out and rape and pillage and people to steal and backstab each other. It is a lot, and it might be in Westeros. That might be intentional. But that seems not only somewhat of a missed opportunity, it also seems unrealistic to me, to a point. And I know it was exaggerated to drive home the other like plot points and main messages that of the author trying to get out in the first place, and I get that. So it's not my biggest complaint. It's not something that I would say is worthy of like not recommending the book to anyone. Yeah, I definitely recommend the book to anyone that wants a powerful, memorable, character-based, character-driven experience about a fantasy nation, conglomerate of kingdoms spiritually imploding and then materially imploding, and the sense of doom that symbolically like contrasts our to or compares to our present world now, when like the universal and often sadly historic vices of ambition and pride, which it is the Clash of Kings itself, which is just an omnipresent, unfortunate reality of the nature of power, is basically let loose upon the land. And so that is the biggest takeaway in general for me. And boy, when action hits, it really can get your blood pumping. It is definitely for the more like red-blooded, like people not afraid to confront elements of their nature. In fact, confronting such negative content could help people understand they're in control, that aspect to their nature better, whether in terms of the present or in terms of potential. So I give Clash of Kings obviously a 20 out of 10, or a 9, or to be honest, to be fair, at least an 11 out of 10. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I could talk about it forever, but I tend to talk too much. Hopefully I didn't in this video. But if you haven't read it, it is a fantasy classic masterpiece in its own unique subgenre of fantasy. I have not been able to find anything that comes close. Certain books in certain areas are on the same level, but only in certain specific areas, usually dealing with style. In terms of overall realization, the world building details so believable and well thought out and well conceived. It adds to the character arc evolutions of ongoing relationships of the characters and stuff and such. In a way that the complete experience, it just lives as a epic original experience that just can't be reproduced, that like I haven't been able to find. And so I think all great writers should read this series and use it as a source of inspiration, in terms of just general impact and little specific immersive qualities they like of the construction of it, to fuel the standard of quality they set for their own writing. Because I think there should and could be more books of this quality and caliber in existence. It's one of the reasons I exist as a critic. I want to bring people to the truth of the reality of the quality of these things. But I am also just one fan, and I have to just throw my opinion into the collective democratic ring of competing opinions and such. I'm always interested in people who don't agree with my opinions and feelings, and I like to be challenged by their ideas and such. But if they're not founded upon truth and stuff, I would have fun debating them politely. That's what I do. And if things get too heated, I leave. But anyway, yes, highly recommend Clash of Kings by George Martin. Better than a Game of Thrones, but read the first one before you read the second one. I will be giving my review of Storm of Swords shortly. Peace.